He mocked her the second she walked into the gala, loud enough for everyone to hear. Still playing small, Emily? Laughter rippled through the room. Glasses paused mid-air, eyes turned to watch her break. But she didn't, her hand steady on the champagne glass, her silence sharper than any reply. And then the room shifted, subtle at first, whispers, heads turning, because someone else had entered, Alexander Vaughn. The billionaire sat and no one ignored, and instead of the stage, he walked straight toward her, past Daniel, past the crowd. Like she was the only person that existed, he stopped inches away, leaned in, and kissed her, slow, deliberate, claiming, and the room went dead silent. Because in that moment, everyone realized something Daniel didn't. Emily Carter was never the one who lost. She was the one who chose when to return. He invited her to the gala to remind her who she used to be. But he had no idea who she had become. The ballroom shimmered in gold and crystal, a sea of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns moving beneath chandeliers the size of small cars. And as the double doors opened, Emily Carter stepped inside, the soft click of her heels barely audible against the polished marble floor, yet somehow every step felt deliberate, measured, like she was walking into something she had already decided the ending of. Her dress simple, deep navy, nothing that screamed for attention, but it held the light in a way that made people look twice without knowing why. A quiet presence in a room built for noise. And for a moment, no one recognized her. Not really. Just another guest blending into the edges of power and wealth. But Emily didn't come to be recognized. She came to be remembered. And she knew exactly who would be there. She had read his name on the invitation weeks ago. Daniel Hayes, keynote speaker, honored guest. The same man who once told her she would never belong in rooms like this without him. The same man who had slowly convinced her that her silence meant weakness and her kindness meant she could be replaced. And now he stood across the room, exactly as she remembered, confident, polished, laughing too loudly at something his new girlfriend whispered into his ear, a woman draped in red, perfectly styled, perfectly positioned at his side like an accessory he had upgraded to. And the sight of them didn't break Emily the way it once would have. Instead, it settled something inside her, something calm, something certain. She picked up a glass of champagne from a passing server, her fingers steady, her breathing even, and for a few seconds, she simply observed the rhythm of the room, the calculated conversations, the quiet competition beneath every smile. It was all the same. Nothing had changed, except her. And then it happened. Daniel turned, his eyes scanning the room out of habit, until they landed on her. And for a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, recognition mixed with disbelief, before it twisted into something sharper, something familiar. He said her name like it was both a question and a challenge. Emily. Loud enough that a few nearby guests turned, curious, sensing the tension before understanding it. He approached slowly, the confidence returning to his stride with every step, his arms still draped around the woman beside him. And when he stopped in front of her, his smile was the same one he used to wear when he thought he had already won. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without seeming obvious, still keeping things modest. The word hung in the air, coated in something sweet and cruel at the same time. A few quiet chuckles rippled nearby, people pretending not to stare while watching everything, waiting for her to shrink, to apologize, to confirm the version of her he had always believed in. But Emily didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even tighten her grip on the glass in her hand. Instead, she met his eyes, calm, unreadable, and in that silence, something shifted, subtle but undeniable. Because this time, she wasn't standing there wondering how to respond. She was deciding how long she would let him speak. And somewhere across the room, unnoticed by most, another pair of eyes had already locked onto her, watching, waiting, as if the real story hadn't even begun. Yet Daniel's smile lingered a second too long, as if he was waiting for the old version of her to surface, the one who would stumble over her words or laugh it off just to ease the tension. But Emily simply tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, and took a small sip of champagne, the glass catching the light between them like a quiet barrier. And for the first time, Daniel's confidence faltered, just barely, just enough for it to register as something unfamiliar. "You look different," he added, softer now. but still edged with that same condescension he had mastered over the years, as if any change in her had to be measured against his approval. And beside him, the woman in red shifted, her manicured fingers tightening around his arm, her smile sharp and assessing as she looked Emily up and down. "Daniel didn't mention you were still around," she said, her tone polite on the surface but hollow underneath, a performance for the room that had already begun to orbit their interaction, and Emily could feel it, the subtle tightening of the space around them. Conversations slowing, glances lingering, people pretending to move on while staying close enough to hear. Because this was the kind of moment these rooms fed on, quiet humiliation dressed as casual conversation, and once, not long ago, Emily would have felt the heat rise in her chest, the instinct to defend herself clawing its way to the surface. But now, there was only stillness, a calm that came from knowing she did not have to prove anything to anyone standing in that circle. She set her glass down on a passing tray without looking, her movements precise, controlled, and when she finally spoke, her voice was even, almost detached. "I did not realize attendance required permission." The words landed lightly, but they carried just enough weight to shift the air again, and a few people nearby exchanged glances, sensing the change without fully understanding it. Daniel let out a short laugh, louder than necessary, reclaiming the moment the only way he knew how, by making it bigger, still the same, he said, shaking his head, though his eyes searched her face as if trying to find the version of her he remembered, always so composed. The word was meant to diminish, to frame her calm as something dull, something lacking, but it did not land the way he intended, because Emily did not react. She did not shrink. She simply looked at him, and in that look was something he had never seen before, not anger, not sadness, but distance, like she was already somewhere beyond his reach, and that unsettled him more than any argument ever could. Across the room, a ripple moved through the crowd, subtle at first, a shift in posture, a change in tone, as if an unseen current had passed through the space, and several heads turned toward the entrance, not in the casual curiosity reserved for ordinary guests, but with a kind of quiet recognition reserved for someone who altered the atmosphere just by arriving. Emily did not turn immediately, but she felt it, the change in the room, the way attention began to pull in a different direction, the way even Daniel's focus flickered for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her, determined to finish what he had started. "You know," he continued, lowering his voice slightly, leaning in just enough to make it feel personal. "These events can be overwhelming if you are not used to them." His words were softer now, almost concerned, but the intention beneath them was the same, to remind her of where she stood in his version of the world, to place her back into the role he had assigned her years ago. And for a moment, Emily let him speak. She let him have that space, that illusion of control, because this time, she was choosing it. She was allowing the scene to unfold exactly as it needed to. Her silence was no longer a weakness, it was timing. And somewhere behind Daniel, moving steadily through the crowd with quiet authority, was the one person in the room who would change everything. And Emily, without turning, already knew he was there. The shift in the room became undeniable when the music seemed to soften without anyone touching it. Conversations thinning into whispers as a path opened naturally through the crowd, and Daniel noticed it too, his sentence cutting off mid-thought as his attention flickered over Emily's shoulder, irritation tightening his jaw at whatever had stolen the moment he was trying to control. "What now?" he muttered under his breath. But Emily did not turn immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of anticipation to settle over everyone watching, and then she moved, not away from Daniel, but slightly to the side, creating space, not for escape, but for arrival. And that was when Alexander Vaughn stepped into view, his presence quiet yet absolute, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that did not need to demand attention because it naturally commanded it, the kind of authority that did not raise its voice, did not rush, did not seek approval. It simply existed and expected the world to adjust. And it did. Conversations stilled, postures straightened, and even the woman on Daniel's arm instinctively eased her grip, as if recognizing something she could not compete with. Alexander's gaze did not scan the room, did not acknowledge the audience that had already begun to orbit him. It settled directly on Emily, steady, certain, as though everything else was background noise. And for the first time since approaching her, Daniel took a small step back without realizing it, his confidence disrupted by a presence he could not immediately read. "Emily," Alexander said, his voice low, calm, familiar in a way that did not need explanation, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any introduction ever could. Emily met his gaze, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that the rest of the room could feel but not understand, a quiet alignment, a shared timing. As if this moment had been decided long before anyone else became aware of it, Alexander closed the distance between them with unhurried steps, stopping just inches away, his hand finding the small of her back with effortless familiarity, not possessive, not performative, but certain, like he belonged there, like she did. And Daniel's voice broke through, sharper now, edged with something dangerously close to uncertainty. "Do I know you?" he asked, forcing a thin smile that did not reach his eyes, trying to reassert control over a situation that was slipping beyond him. But Alexander did not look at him, not yet. His attention remained on Emily, and he leaned in slightly, his words meant only for her, though the entire room strained to hear them. "Ready?" he asked quietly. And Emily's answer was not spoken. It was in the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her chin lifted just a fraction, the way she did not hesitate. And then, without rush, without spectacle, Alexander kissed her, a single deliberate moment that landed like a declaration rather than a display. And the room fell completely silent, not out of shock alone, but because something fundamental had just been rewritten in front of them. Daniel's expression froze, the color draining slightly from his face as realization tried and failed to catch up with what he was seeing. The woman he had just dismissed, the woman he believed still existed within his reach, standing at the center of a moment he did not control, did not understand, and could not undo. Whispers began, quick and sharp, names being exchanged, connections forming in real time. And then from across the room, the master of ceremonies, clearly thrown off script, stepped forward with a forced composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice tightening as he adjusted his notes. "A brief correction. Our primary investor for tonight's foundation is not only Mr. Vaughn." He paused, glancing toward them, "but his partner, Ms. Emily Carter." And the words landed heavier than any applause that followed, because in that instant, every assumption in the room collapsed, and Emily, without looking at Daniel again, simply offered a small, composed smile, not of triumph, not of revenge, but of quiet certainty, before turning with Alexander and stepping forward into a place that had always been hers. Whether anyone had recognized it or not, the applause came a second too late, uneven at first, as if the room needed time to recalibrate what it had just witnessed, and Emily could feel it, the shift not just in attention but in perception. The same faces that had moments ago watched her with quiet curiosity now studied her with something sharper, something closer to respect, or perhaps caution, as she walked beside Alexander toward the front of the ballroom, her pace steady, her posture relaxed, not performing, not claiming, simply existing in a space that no longer questioned her presence. And behind her, she did not need to turn to know that Daniel was still standing exactly where she had left him, caught in the aftermath of a moment he could not rewrite, his world reorganizing itself around a truth he had never considered, that she had moved on without needing his acknowledgement, that she had built something he could not see, and that realization settled into him with a weight that no words could compete with. At the front, Alexander paused just slightly, giving her the smallest nod, not leading, not directing, but aligning, and Emily stepped forward as the master of ceremonies gestured toward her with a renewed tone of deference, his earlier uncertainty replaced with a polished respect. "Miss Carter," he said, offering her the microphone. And for a brief second, the entire room held its breath, waiting to see how she would define the moment, whether she would address the tension still lingering in the air, whether she would acknowledge the past standing behind her in plain sight. But Emily did not look back. She did not reference Daniel, did not explain, did not justify. She simply spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying effortlessly across the room without needing to rise. "Thank you for being here tonight," she began, and there was something disarming in its simplicity, something that forced the audience to lean in rather than pull away. This foundation was built on the idea that opportunity should not depend on who you know or where you come from. She continued, her words measured, deliberate, each one landing with quiet precision. It should depend on what you are willing to build when no one is watching. And as she spoke, there were subtle reactions across the room, small shifts in expression, the recognition that her words were not abstract, that they carried the weight of something lived, something earned. And in the back, Daniel finally moved, a step forward, then another, as if drawn by something he could not name. His confidence fractured into something more uncertain, more human, but still unwilling to fully let go of the version of reality he had constructed. The woman at his side whispering something urgent, trying to pull him back into the safety of dismissal, but he barely heard her now. Because for the first time, he was seeing Emily without the filter of who he believed she was, and it unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. On stage, Emily finished her remarks not with a grand statement, but with a quiet conclusion. "Tonight is not about recognition," she said, her gaze sweeping the room briefly before settling forward again. "It is about what happens after the room forgets your name." And then she handed the microphone back without hesitation, without lingering for applause, because she did not need it. The impact had already landed, and as the applause rose again, stronger this time, more certain, she stepped back beside Alexander. Their movements synchronized without effort, and for a moment, she allowed herself a small breath, not of relief, but of completion, because this was never about proving anything to Daniel or anyone else in that room. It was about reclaiming something he had once convinced her she did not own, her place, her voice, her timing. And as she turned slightly, just enough for her gaze to pass over him one final time, it was not with anger or triumph, but with something far quieter, something far more final, the absence of need. And that, more than anything, was what Daniel could not stand, because in that silence, he understood, not all at once, but enough, that whatever power he thought he held over her had never truly belonged to him at all. The applause lingered even as Emily stepped down from the stage, but it no longer sounded like noise to fill a room. It sounded like something shifting, something settling into place. And as she moved through the crowd beside Alexander, the same people who had once watched her with detached curiosity now turned toward her with open recognition, conversations pausing, bodies angling subtly to make space, as if the room itself had decided to rearrange its hierarchy without needing to announce it. And Emily noticed it all without reacting to it, her expression unchanged, her steps measured, because this was not new to her, not anymore. It was simply visible now, and that was the only difference. A man in a gray suit approached first, extending his hand with a practiced smile that carried a new level of respect. "Miss Carter, I had no idea you were involved in the foundation," he said, his tone carefully balanced between admiration and recalibration, and Emily accepted the handshake briefly, her grip firm, her nod polite. "It has been a quiet process," she replied, her voice even, offering nothing more than necessary. And the man seemed to understand, stepping back without pressing further, as others began to follow, one by one, drawn not just by her connection to Alexander, but by the presence she carried on her own. And across the room, Daniel finally broke through the invisible boundary that had held him in place, his steps faster now, less controlled, as if urgency had replaced calculation, the woman beside him struggling to keep pace, her earlier composure cracking into something sharper, more defensive. But Daniel barely acknowledged her as he approached, stopping just a few feet away from Emily and Alexander, his voice cutting in before the next conversation could begin. "Emily," he said, and this time, there was no attempt to mask it with humor or charm, only a strained attempt to reclaim something that had already slipped from his grasp. And Emily turned, slowly, not because she was caught off guard, but because she chose to acknowledge him, her gaze steady, unreadable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching in a way that felt heavier than anything he could have said earlier. Alexander remained beside her, not intervening, not stepping forward, simply present, his stillness a quiet confirmation that he did not need to assert anything. And Daniel exhaled, running a hand briefly through his hair, as if searching for the right version of himself to present. "You could have told me," he said finally, the words coming out softer than intended, edged with something unfamiliar, something closer to confusion than arrogance. And Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him, not with emotion, but with distance. "Told you what?" she asked, her tone calm, almost curious, and that question, simple as it was, seemed to catch him off balance more than any accusation could have, because it forced him to confront the assumption beneath his words, that he still had a place in her narrative, that he was still someone she needed to inform, to include, to explain herself to. And for the first time, Daniel did not have an immediate answer, his silence revealing more than any explanation ever could. The woman at his side stepped forward then, her voice sharper now, unable to hold back the tension any longer. "This is ridiculous," she said, her gaze flicking between Emily and Alexander. "You act like you are suddenly." But she stopped herself, the sentence dissolving under the weight of the room that no longer supported her tone, and Emily did not respond to her, did not engage, because she did not need to. Her focus remained on Daniel for one final second, and in that look, there was no anger, no satisfaction, only clarity, a quiet understanding that whatever connection had once existed between them no longer held any relevance in this moment. And then, without another word, she turned away, her movement smooth, final, stepping forward alongside Alexander as the crowd parted once again, and behind her, Daniel remained where he was, not because he could not follow, but because for the first time, he did not know where he stood, and that uncertainty settled into him with a weight he could not shake. As the realization began to take shape, not all at once, but enough to linger, that the woman he thought he had left behind was never waiting to be found again. She had simply moved beyond the reach of where he thought she belonged. Emily did not slow down as she moved toward the quieter edge of the ballroom, where the noise softened into a low hum and the air felt less crowded, less performative. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe fully, not because she was overwhelmed, but because the moment she had anticipated had already passed, executed exactly as she intended, and now what remained was not tension, but clarity. Alexander stayed beside her, his presence steady, unintrusive, as if he understood that this silence was not empty, it was necessary. "You handled that better than most would," he said after a moment, his voice low enough that it did not break the calm around them, and Emily let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a smile, though it never fully formed. "It was not about handling it," she replied, her gaze drifting briefly across the room where the energy had already begun to shift into new conversations, new narratives forming around what had just happened. "It was about not letting it matter," and Alexander studied her for a second, not questioning, not probing, simply acknowledging the weight behind her words, because he knew enough of her past to understand what it had taken to reach that point. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable, earned, until Emily's eyes settled on a distant corner of the ballroom, where a mirrored wall reflected fragments of the evening back at her, the light, the movement, the people, and for a brief moment, her reflection stood among them, composed, unshaken, but behind it, another version lingered, one she had spent years learning to leave behind. She remembered the first gala she had ever attended with Daniel, how the lights had felt too bright, how every conversation had sounded like it carried hidden meaning she was expected to understand, how she had stood beside him, smiling at the right moments, speaking only when spoken to, carefully measuring every word as if it could be used against her. And she remembered the way he used to lean in, correcting her quietly, not loud enough for others to hear, but sharp enough to make her doubt herself. "Do not say that," or "that is not how this works." And over time, those small corrections had built something larger, something that convinced her she did not belong unless she followed his lead, unless she stayed within the version of herself he approved of. And the memory did not hurt anymore, not in the way it once did. It simply existed, like an old photograph she no longer recognized herself in. "You knew he would be here," Alexander said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation, and Emily nodded once, her gaze steady. "Of course," she replied. "He always is, in rooms like this." And there was no bitterness in her tone, only fact. because Daniel had never left this world. He had only assumed she could not exist in it without him, and that assumption had been the one thing she needed to dismantle, not for him, but for herself. And you still came, Alexander added, a faint note of respect threading through his voice. And this time, Emily did smile, just slightly. I did not come for him, she said, her eyes shifting back toward the center of the room where the evening continued as if nothing had happened, even though everything had changed. I came because I do not leave rooms that were built for me just because someone else thinks I do not belong. And the words settled between them with quiet certainty, and Alexander nodded once, as if that was the only confirmation needed, because this had never been about a single moment, a single interaction. It had been about a long, deliberate reconstruction of something she had once allowed someone else to define. And as Emily turned slightly, her gaze passing over the crowd one more time, she did not look for Daniel, did not search for any reaction, because she no longer needed to see it. The outcome was not measured by his response, it was measured by her own, and for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing left to prove, only something left to continue, something she had already started long before this night, and would carry forward long. After the lights dimmed and the room forgot what it had witnessed, the music swelled again as if the room had decided to move forward, but something underneath it had changed, a subtle recalibration that could not be undone, and Emily could feel it in the way conversations shifted when she passed, in the way people paused just half a second longer before speaking to her, choosing their words more carefully now, measuring their tone against a new understanding of who she was, and yet none of it altered her pace, because she was no longer reacting to rooms like this. She was simply moving through them, and as she reached the balcony doors, the cool night air slipping in through the narrow opening, she stepped outside without hesitation, the city stretching below in a grid of light and motion, distant sirens blending with the soft hum of traffic far beneath the 20-story height. And for a moment, the noise of the Gala faded behind her, replaced by something quieter, something real. She rested her hand lightly on the stone railing, the surface cool beneath her fingertips, grounding, familiar in a way the ballroom could never be. And she closed her eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to settle, to acknowledge that what had just happened was not a turning point. It was a confirmation. You always do that. Alexander's voice came from behind her, calm, observant, and she did not need to turn to know he had followed. His presence never intrusive, always deliberate. Step away right after the room starts watching, he added, and there was no judgment in it, only quiet curiosity, and Emily let out a soft breath, her gaze returning to the city lights. Because that is when they start projecting, she said, her tone steady. They see what they want to see, and it has nothing to do with me. And Alexander stepped beside her, leaning slightly against the railing, his posture relaxed, as if the weight of the room behind them had never touched him. And what do you see? He asked, not looking at her directly, but at the skyline, giving her the space to answer without pressure. And Emily considered the question, not because she did not know, but because she chose her words carefully now, not out of fear, but out of precision. I see distance, she said finally, between who I was when I believed him, and who I am now. And the words did not carry resentment, only clarity, because the past no longer held power over her. It only explained how she had learned to take it back. Behind them, the balcony door opened briefly, laughter spilling out before it closed again, the world inside continuing its performance. But neither of them turned toward it, because neither of them needed to be inside it to understand it. He will come out here, Alexander said after a moment, his voice quiet, certain, and Emily's lips curved into the faintest hint of a knowing smile. Not surprised, not concerned, simply aware. Of course he will, she replied, her gaze steady. He has never been good at letting go of things he thinks belong to him. And there was no anger in her words, only observation. Because Daniel was predictable in the ways that mattered. His need to resolve what he did not understand stronger than his ability to accept it, and as if summoned by the very thought, the door opened again, slower this time, the sound of it cutting through the quiet space between them, and footsteps followed, measured but uneven, carrying something heavier than confidence. Emily did not turn immediately. She let the moment settle, let the space define itself before acknowledging what she already knew was coming. Because this time, she was not bracing for impact. She was deciding how much of it she would allow to reach her. And as the footsteps stopped a few feet behind her, the air shifted once more, not with tension, but with expectation, and in that silence, one thing became clear. This conversation was no longer about what Daniel wanted to say. It was about what Emily was willing to hear. Daniel stopped a few feet behind her, close enough for his presence to be felt, not close enough to reclaim anything that had already slipped beyond him. And for a moment, he said nothing, as if the words he had rehearsed inside the ballroom no longer fit the space out here, where there was no audience to perform for, only the quiet honesty of distance. "Emily," he finally said, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge he had carried earlier, and she turned slowly, not startled, not hesitant, simply acknowledging him on her own terms, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, the city lights reflecting faintly in her eyes. And for the first time, Daniel noticed something he had never seen before, not because it was new, but because he had never looked closely enough. She was not waiting for his reaction, not bracing for his opinion. She was simply present, complete in a way that did not include him. And that realization unsettled him more than anything else that had happened that night. "I did not know," he said, the words coming out uneven, as if he was still trying to decide what exactly he had not known, her position, her partnership, or the fact that she no longer existed in the version of her he had constructed. And Emily tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "No," she replied quietly. "You did not." And she did not elaborate, did not offer him a bridge back into her world, because there was none. And Daniel exhaled, his hand resting briefly against the railing as if he needed something solid to hold on to. "You could have told me what you were building," he continued, his tone softer now, almost searching, and Alexander, still beside Emily, shifted his weight slightly but did not intervene, his silence a deliberate choice, allowing the moment to unfold without influence. And Emily's expression did not change, but there was a clarity in her eyes that made the answer inevitable. "Why would I?" she asked, not with accusation, not with anger, but with simple logic, and that question landed heavier than anything else she had said, because it exposed the assumption beneath his words, the belief that he was still someone she needed to inform, someone entitled to her progress, her growth, her success. And Daniel's gaze dropped for a second before lifting again, searching her face for something familiar, something he could hold on to. "Because we were," he began, but the sentence trailed off, unfinished, because even he could hear how incomplete it sounded, how rooted. It was in a past that no longer existed in the present, and Emily did not help him finish it. She did not fill in the silence, because she had already moved beyond needing to define what they once were. "We were what we were," she said finally, her voice calm, closing the space he had tried to reopen without harshness, without sentiment, just fact. And the simplicity of it left no room for negotiation. The city hummed quietly around them, a distant reminder that the world continued whether or not moments like this resolved the way people expected them to. And Daniel straightened slightly, as if trying to recover some version of himself that felt more stable, more certain. "You seem different," he said, the observation weaker now, stripped of its earlier condescension, and this time, Emily did allow a faint smile to touch her lips, not for him, but for the truth of it. "I am," she replied, and there was nothing more to add, because that was the entire point. She had changed in ways he had never stayed long enough to understand, and would never have access to now, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was definitive, because in that moment, Daniel understood something he had not been prepared to face, that there was no argument to win here, no explanation that would restore his place in her life, no version of the past that could be reintroduced to reshape the present. And Emily, feeling the shift settle into its final form, turned slightly back toward the city, her attention no longer on him, not out of dismissal, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. And in that quiet, unmistakable gesture, Daniel realized that whatever connection he thought still existed between them had not been broken. It had simply been outgrown. Daniel did not move right away, even after her attention drifted back to the city. as if he was waiting for something to pull him back into relevance, some reaction that would reopen the conversation and give him a reason to stay. But nothing came. Only the quiet hum of the night and the steady presence of two people who no longer needed him to define the moment. And that absence of response settled into him heavier than any rejection, because it was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was simply final. "So that is it," he said after a moment, his voice tighter now, not angry, but strained, searching for something solid to hold on to. "You just moved on." And the way he said it made it sound like an accusation, like a betrayal of something he believed should have remained unchanged. And Emily turned her head slightly, not fully facing him, but enough to acknowledge the question, her expression calm, untouched by the weight he tried to place on it. "No," she said quietly. "I moved forward." And the distinction was subtle, but it landed with precision, because moving on implied leaving something behind unresolved, while moving forward meant she had already processed it, understood it, and chosen a direction that did not include returning. And Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "That is easy to say now," he replied, his gaze flicking briefly toward Alexander before returning to her, as if trying to find an explanation that fit his understanding. "When everything worked out for you." And there it was again, the same framework he had always used, reducing her growth to circumstance, to luck, to something external that justified why he had not seen it coming. And for the first time since he stepped onto the balcony, Emily's expression shifted, not into anger, but into something sharper, more defined. "It did not work out," she said, her voice still calm, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "I built it." And the words were not loud, but they did not need to be, because they carried years of quiet effort, decisions made without recognition, steps taken without validation. And for a moment, Daniel had no response, because that version of her did not fit into the narrative he had always relied on, the one where she existed in relation to him. And Alexander finally turned his head slightly, his gaze resting on Daniel with a calm that felt more like a boundary than a challenge, not confrontational, not aggressive, simply present, reinforcing what had already been made clear without needing to say a word. And Daniel felt it, the shift in dynamics that no longer placed him at the center, and it unsettled him in a way he could not disguise. "I did not think you would," he started, but stopped again, the sentence unraveling before it could take shape, because whatever he had expected from her had already been proven irrelevant. And Emily did not wait for him to finish, because she already understood what he was trying to say, what he had always believed. "You did not think I could exist without you," she said, completing the thought with a clarity that left no room for denial. And Daniel's silence confirmed it more than any admission could have, the city lights stretching endlessly behind her as she stood there, no longer framed by his perception, but by her own. And for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, something that resembled realization, or perhaps regret, but it came too late to matter, because Emily was not waiting for it. She had never needed it, and she turned fully back toward the skyline, her focus settling on something beyond the balcony, beyond the night, something that extended far past this moment. And as the silence settled once more, it became clear that whatever conversation Daniel thought he came out here to have had already ended before he arrived, because the answer he was looking for was not something she needed to give. It was something he needed to understand on his own. And as he stood there, unsure of what to say next, for the first time in a very long time, he realized he was no longer part of her story, not as a chapter waiting to be revisited, but as something that had already been closed and left exactly where it belonged. Daniel stood there a moment longer, as if the silence might shift in his favor if he waited it out. But it did not. It only deepened, pressing against him with a quiet finality he could not negotiate with. And for the first time that night, he understood something he had never allowed himself to consider, that there was nothing left to reclaim, nothing left to correct, and certainly nothing left to control. His gaze lingered on Emily for a second longer, searching for any trace of the woman he once knew, the one who would have softened, explained, or tried to make things easier for him. But she was not there, not because she had disappeared, but because she had evolved beyond the version he had chosen to remember. And with a small, almost imperceptible shift of his shoulders, he stepped back, not in defeat, but in recognition, and without another word, He turned and walked toward the door, the sound of it opening and closing behind him quieter than expected, as if even the room itself did not need to acknowledge his exit. Emily did not watch him leave. She did not follow his movement or measure his reaction, because she did not need to. Whatever closure that moment required had already happened long before he stepped onto the balcony, and now it simply existed as a confirmation, something complete, something finished. Beside her, Alexander remained still for a moment, his gaze briefly following the direction Daniel had gone before returning to the skyline. "You did not need to say much," he said quietly, not as a compliment, but as an observation, and Emily let out a slow breath, the tension she had not acknowledged easing from her shoulders in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. "I said enough," she replied, and there was no pride in it, only certainty, because the weight of her words had never depended on their volume, only their truth. The city stretched endlessly before them, lights flickering in patterns that felt distant and constant at the same time. A reminder that the world moved forward whether or not moments like this were resolved, and Emily rested her hand lightly against the railing again, her fingers tracing the cool edge without thinking, grounding herself in something tangible, something real. "He will understand eventually," Alexander added after a moment, his tone neutral, as if he was stating a fact rather than offering reassurance, and Emily shook her head slightly, her gaze steady. "That is not mine to wait for," she said, and the simplicity of it carried a quiet finality, because she was no longer tied to his timeline, his realization, or his need for explanation. She had stepped out of that entirely, and there was nothing left pulling her back. Behind them, the music shifted again, the rhythm of the gala continuing as if nothing had happened. But Emily knew better. Moments like this did not need to be loud to be lasting. They reshaped things quietly, in ways that revealed themselves over time, in conversations, in perceptions, in the way people recalibrated their understanding of power and presence. And she turned slightly, her attention drifting back toward the ballroom, not with hesitation, but with intention, because she was not stepping away from the night. She was choosing how to re-enter it, on her terms. "We should go back," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a natural continuation, and Alexander nodded once, falling into step beside her without question, and as they moved toward the door, Emily paused for just a fraction of a second, her reflection catching briefly in the glass, not the version of her that once stood beside Daniel uncertain and silent, but the one standing here now, composed, grounded, fully her own, and there was no comparison, no lingering doubt, only recognition. And as she pushed the door open and stepped back into the light, the room shifted once more, not because she demanded it, but because it had already learned to respond to her presence. And this time, she did not observe it from the outside. She moved through it with quiet authority, no longer navigating the space, but defining it, and somewhere in the background, conversations resumed, alliances adjusted, perceptions rewritten, but Emily did not follow any of them, because she was no longer reacting to the room. She was the reason it felt different, and for the first time that night, there was no tension left in her chest, only a steady, unshakable sense of something she had built for herself, something no one could take, redefine, or diminish. And as she walked forward beside Alexander, it was clear that this was no longer a return, it was a continuation, one that had nothing to do with the past she left behind, and everything to do with the future she had already chosen. When Emily stepped back into the ballroom, the shift was no longer subtle, it was established, solid, like something that had already settled into the foundation of the room itself. Conversations did not stop this time. They adjusted, bending slightly to accommodate her presence instead of pausing to evaluate it. And as she moved through the space, there was no hesitation in the way people acknowledged her, no uncertainty in the way her name was spoken. It carried differently now, not as a question, but as a recognition that had been earned and confirmed. And Emily did not slow her pace, did not linger for validation, because she had already moved beyond needing it. A group of investors near the center shifted as she approached, one of them stepping forward with a respectful nod. "Ms. Carter, your work with the foundation has been impressive," he said, choosing his words carefully, as if aware that anything less precise would not land the same way. and Emily inclined her head slightly, accepting the acknowledgement without expanding on it. "It has been intentional," she replied, her tone calm, leaving no space for exaggeration or modesty, just fact. And Alexander remained beside her, not leading the conversation, not overshadowing it, simply aligned, his presence reinforcing rather than defining hers. And across the room, near the far edge of the bar, Daniel stood alone now. The woman who had been on his arm earlier engaged in a separate conversation that did not include him, her posture angled away, her attention already shifting toward more stable ground. And for the first time that evening, Daniel was not at the center of any interaction, not the source of attention, not the anchor of conversation. He was simply there, observing a room that no longer responded to him the way it once did. And as his gaze followed Emily, moving effortlessly through the space he once believed belonged to him, something settled into him that he could not ignore, not jealousy, not anger, but a quiet understanding of distance, the kind that does not close once it has been created. Back among the crowd, Emily was listening now, engaged in a conversation about expansion, about future partnerships, about opportunities that extended beyond the scope of the evening, and her responses were measured, clear, grounded in something that did not require performance. She was not trying to impress. She was not trying to prove. She was simply present in the reality she had built, and that presence carried more weight than any introduction ever could. "We are looking at long-term impact," she said, her voice steady. "Not visibility, not immediate return, but sustainability." And the people around her nodded, not because they were agreeing out of politeness, but because they recognized the clarity behind her words, the understanding that came from experience rather than theory. And as the conversation continued, the room seemed to organize itself around her, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable shift of attention, and Emily felt it without reacting to it, because she was no longer measuring her place in rooms like this, she was defining it. And for a brief moment, her gaze moved across the crowd, not searching, not comparing, just observing, and it passed over Daniel without stopping, without changing, as if he were simply part of the background now. And that, more than anything else that had happened that night, was what marked the true change, not the moment on stage, not the introduction, not even the conversation on the balcony, but this, the absence of significance, the quiet release of something that no longer held weight in her world. And as Emily turned her attention back to the conversation in front of her, her voice steady, her presence grounded, it became clear that this was not a moment of triumph. It was a continuation of something far more powerful, a life that no longer needed to be measured against what she had left behind, but only against what she was continuing to build. Moving forward, the night carried on with a polished rhythm. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had already taken hold, and Emily could feel it not in the noise, but in the pauses between it, in the way conversations subtly shifted direction when she entered them, in the way people listened more carefully when she spoke, not because they were impressed, but because they recognized something grounded, something real, and she did not rush through any of it. She did not chase opportunity or extend her presence beyond what felt natural. She simply remained steady, intentional, allowing the evening to unfold without forcing it. And beside her, Alexander moved with the same quiet alignment, speaking when necessary, stepping back when it mattered, his presence never competing, always reinforcing. And as the hours passed, the gala softened into something less performative, more honest, as if the earlier tension had been absorbed into a new understanding that no one needed to articulate. Across the room, Daniel had not left, not yet, but he had changed positions, no longer near the center, no longer surrounded by attention. He stood closer to the edges now, a drink untouched in his hand, watching in a way he had never watched before, not with judgment, not with control, but with a quiet recognition that the space he once occupied had shifted beyond him. And every now and then, his gaze would find Emily, not with expectation, but with something more distant, more reflective, as if he was trying to understand the version of her he had never taken the time to see. And Emily noticed it once, briefly, not directly, but in the peripheral awareness she had developed over time, and for a moment, she allowed herself to register it, not as validation, not as regret, but simply as part of the room. And then she let it go, because it no longer carried weight. It no longer defined anything about her presence or her path. And as the final portion of the evening approached, the master of ceremonies returned to the stage, offering closing remarks that felt lighter now, less formal, more grounded in the reality of what the night had become. And when he invited Emily and Alexander forward once more, there was no hesitation in the room, no uncertainty in the applause that followed. It was steady, earned, reflective of something that had already been accepted rather than newly introduced. And Emily stepped forward again, not to claim anything, not to reinforce her position, but simply to stand where she belonged, her posture relaxed, her expression calm. And as she looked out across the room, she did not see a crowd that needed to be convinced. She saw a space that had already adjusted, already understood. And in that moment, there was a quiet sense of completion, not because the story had ended, but because a chapter had closed without the need for conflict or resolution beyond what had already been lived. And when the applause settled and the lights softened, Emily stepped back once more, her gaze drifting briefly across the room one final time, not searching, not comparing, just acknowledging the space for what it was. And somewhere near the far edge, Daniel remained, still, silent, no longer trying to step forward, no longer attempting to reclaim what had already moved beyond him. And for the first time, there was no tension in that distance, no unfinished thread pulling at the edges of the moment, only a quiet understanding that some things do not end with confrontation, they end with clarity. And as Emily turned away, walking beside Alexander toward the exit, the room continued behind her, unchanged in its surface, but fundamentally altered in its balance. And she did not look back, not because she needed to prove anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention. And as the doors opened and the cool night air met her once more, it was not an escape. It was simply the next step forward, one she had already chosen long before this night ever began.